Having a dad who's totally into superstitions really bites.
It is time for the husband and wife to go to the matrimonial chamber.
For a bit of luck, Earl actually married off his newly adult daughter, Thyri, to a 90-year-old codger who's half in the grave already. Earl Bjarni, with his white beard and blackened teeth, made Siggy so nauseated that she just up and left in disgust. She just couldn't get why her husband, a lord who lived in luxury and commanded respect, would marry their daughter off to such an old wreck. Haraldson tried to explain to his wife that he had consulted a seer the night before. The seer warned of an imminent uprising within the Vikings, led by none other than Ragnar. Moreover, he foresaw Haraldson's bones and skull shattered all over by Ragnar. That night, Haraldson was so worried and scared, he couldn't find peace or comfort, not knowing where Ragnar was hiding. To nullify this bad omen, Haraldson felt he had no choice but to marry off his daughter. Bjarni might be old, but at least he was an earl, just like him. Seeing she couldn't persuade her husband, Siggy agreed verbally, all the while secretly planning a way to save her daughter. The wedding went ahead as planned, and Haraldson hosted a grand banquet for his daughter, Thyri. Rollo's unexpected arrival gave Thyri a sliver of hope. She looked eagerly at the man she had long fancied, wishing he had come to carry her off, so she wouldn't have to marry Bjarni. But things didn't go as hoped. Rollo didn't even give Thyri a second glance. From the moment he entered, his eyes were fixated on Siggy. Haraldson also saw Rollo in the crowd and immediately went over to him and asked him what he was doing here. Rollo got straight to the point, saying, "Our raiding party's ships have been confiscated, and everyone is being watched by your men. We Vikings are born to raid and fight. Keeping us under surveillance benefits neither side." Haraldson said he'd consider letting them go to sea again if Rollo revealed where his brother Ragnar was hiding.
Ragnar is dead.
You swear that on your arm ring?
No.
Then why?
I cannot swear because I have not seen a body. But I have heard nothing, and he is my brother. I'm sure in my heart he is dead.
Of course, Haraldson couldn't believe Rollo's word, but to avoid disrupting his daughter's wedding, he pretended to believe him, planning to capture and interrogate Rollo after the ceremony. What Haraldson doesn't notice is that there seems to be a slight hint of an affair between Siggy and Rollo. Then Haraldson declared the wedding complete in time for the bridal chamber.
It is time for the husband and wife to go to the matrimonial chamber.
Seeing her son-in-law, decades her senior, Siggy was disgusted beyond words. Deep down, she had grown to despise her husband thoroughly. After the wedding, Siggy met with Rollo in a dark room. After a brief intimacy, Siggy warned Rollo that Earl was cunning and deceitful and wouldn't let him off easily. Rollo wasn't worried, but as soon as he left, he was captured by Haraldson's men. Haraldson had Rollo brutally tortured, but Rollo never revealed Ragnar's whereabouts. Finally, Haraldson carved several cuts across his face with a knife. Meanwhile, Ragnar, who was hiding, learned of Rollo's capture. He was in agony, knowing his brother's torture could lead to death at any moment, though his injuries hadn't healed. Ragnar knew he could not save Rollo, nor could he let the innocent villagers die. After much thought, Ragnar came up with a bold plan.
I have another favor to ask of you. I want you to go into Ket. I want you to ask for a meeting with the Earl, and when you meet him, challenge him to a personal combat with me. Tell me if he refuses, shame will stalk him for the rest of his life, and Odin will never permit him into Valhalla.
Following Ragnar's orders, Floki conveyed his message to Haraldson word for word, especially emphasizing, "If you don't agree, Valhalla will not welcome you, and shame will follow you forever." But Haraldson wasn't a fool. With many followers and power in his hands, he thought, why risk fighting a strong, healthy young man in a duel? Just find a few men to kill Ragnar. There's no need for me to take this risk.
The challenge is declined. When Ragnar Lothbrok appears in Kattegat, he will be put in chains.
In the midst of their conversation, Haraldson suddenly remembered the seer's words. Killing Ragnar would solve everything. Besides, Ragnar had been evading him, and there was nothing he could do about it. It might be better to resolve this while Ragnar was still injured. And so, Haraldson accepted Ragnar's challenge. On the eve of their duel, Haraldson confessed his true feelings to his wife. He saw his younger self in Ragnar, fully aware that Ragnar's views on the Western world were correct. But he couldn't support Ragnar's ideas, because that would mean his supporters would defect to Ragnar's side.
The seer promised you would kill him.
Yes.
For a moment, Siggy even wished it was her husband who would die. On the day of the decisive battle, Ragnar, limping, arrived at the harbor, where the shoreline was already crowded with onlookers. Rollo was released, his face marked with the scars of shame by Haraldsson. Such an important duel naturally attracted Thyri and her 90-year-old husband to the scene. The duel officially began with Sven announcing the rules. Viking duels had a unique style, with shield, axe, and sword as the main weapons. Each person could use 2 shields, and after the second shield was damaged, no more shields could be used. Haraldsson started by discarding a shield, considering his youthful reputation as a war deity, which had secured him the position of a lord. Ragnar, not wanting to take advantage, dropped his shield and launched the first attack. It must be said, Haraldsson truly had some skills, completely dominating the upper hand. Seeing Ragnar discard his shield and sword, Haraldsson also threw away his shield and sword. The duel entered its final stage, with the final contest being the battle axe. Ragnar, dragging his injured leg, barely managed to fend off Haraldsson's assault. Ragnar was caught off guard and struck by Haraldsson. Although the wound was not deep, it sliced open Ragnar's not yet healed arrow wound. Ragnar had no choice but to cover his wound and continue the fight. In the end, it was clear that age was an insurmountable barrier. Haraldsson gradually lost the strength to fight. Ragnar's battle axe struck Haraldsson in the back, and he could never stand up again. Ultimately, the gods sided with Ragnar, taking Haraldsson to Valhalla. Seeing their leader dead, Sven panicked and ordered Ragnar killed, but there was no response from the crowd. Long-term oppression had made the people long for this moment. Rollo slowly approached Sven, took up an axe, and struck Sven's chest. Siggy took this opportunity to stride towards Thyri, pulling out the knife that Thyri had ready, and sent Bjarni to the afterlife. Siggy wanted to inherit her husband's earldom, but as she looked around, all eyes were on Ragnar. Knowing the will of the people, Siggy graciously supported Ragnar as the new lord.
Hail, O Ragnar!
Hail, O Ragnar!
Amid the cheers of the people, Ragnar finally ascended to the lordship, officially starting a new chapter in the conquest of the Western world. Over 1,000 years ago in Europe, there existed a terrifying and worldview-shattering burial rite, the Viking practice of human sacrifice. Unlike typical human sacrifices, the Viking ritual involved a female slave who was forced to have intercourse with every man in the village until she was ultimately strangled or had her throat cut. Then, the female slave would be placed alongside her master's corpse on a burning ship to drift away. Today, you'll witness one of the 13 most unusual burial ceremonies in the world, just after Ragnar killed Haraldsson and took his place as lord. Despite Haraldsson's greed and cunning, Ragnar decided to hold a grand funeral for him, as Haraldsson was also a brave Viking warrior deserving of such an honor. Ragnar intended to show Athelstan the customs of the Vikings, so he took him inside a tent, where they saw 2 women cleaning a woman's body. Athelstan asked in disbelief,
Who is she? All of his slave women were asked who wants to die with him. This one agreed. She wants to die? These other servants are preparing her.
The town was buzzing with activity, as people roasted beef and lamb, sang, and danced to celebrate the grand funeral. Here, Athelstan met Ragnar's son, Bjorn. As they were tasting malt beer, they saw the female slave being led from house to house by 2 women, knocking on the doors of the town's men.
What are they doing?
She is having sex with the men who live in there. Each one of them says to her, "Tell your master I did this out of love for him." Because she will soon be reunited with her master in death, and she will be able to speak to him.
Athelstan was completely speechless at this, but what came next left him even more dumbfounded. At the coast, too, the crowd was thick, led by Siggy and Thyri. Haraldsson's body was carried to the port, where a seer was already waiting for them. Under the guidance of the seer, Haraldson was placed by the crowd on a small ship piled with wood. Soon, the female slave was brought before the seer, seen limping and staggering in her walk. The seer removed the jewelry the slave had just worn, then made her drink a cup of holy water. Until now, the slave girl was full of hope that she could continue to serve her master in the other world.
I can see my master. He is in Valhalla. Let me join him then.
Amid the crowd's cheers, the seer drew a dagger and slit the female slave's throat. Then the people lifted her onto the ship to be buried with Haraldson. Athelstan couldn't bear to watch any longer. As a Christian, he simply couldn't appreciate the beliefs and customs of the Vikings. Siggy approached Ragnar, hoping to personally light the funeral pyre, but Ragnar merely scoffed. He would never entrust such an important task to a widow. As people sang and danced, the crowd set the ship ablaze, sending Haraldson and the female slave to Valhalla. After the funeral, Lagertha told her husband she was pregnant again. Faced with this gift from the gods, Ragnar was overjoyed. In stark contrast, Siggy was preparing to flee with her daughter, sensing her own end was near, as new lords typically treated the old lord's family this way. Just then, Rollo burst in, telling Siggy he knew Ragnar well. Unlike previous lords, Ragnar would not kill innocent family members out of spite, and he, Rollo, would guarantee their safety for life.
What do you want in return?
Would you not like to be married to another one?
Who?
From Rollo's gaze, it was evident he was not content to remain subordinate to his brother. As the long winter was about to end and Lagertha's belly grew day by day, Ragnar plotted his next voyage to raid the Western world. Previously constrained by Haraldson, he could only conduct small-scale raids. Now, as a lord, he plans to expand his ambitions, targeting the capital of the Kingdom of Northumbria. In the summer of 794 AD, 3 Viking ships led by Ragnar sailed towards the Kingdom of Northumbria. This time, they didn't land on shallow beaches but steered directly into England's River Tyne, advancing into the kingdom's interior. Upon hearing this news, General Wigia immediately reported it to King El. El was baffled at the audacity of these barbarians daring to sail directly into the heart of his kingdom.
I merely said they fought like demons, like men possessed, with no fear of death.
Seeing Wigia's cowardly demeanor, El could no longer stand it and had Wigia thrown into a pit full of snakes.
Now, let us prepare to defend ourselves against these heathens and barbarians.
King El urgently convened forces from all over England to defend against the enemy, and he also recalled his brother, Lord Ethelwulf, to serve as general. Ethelwulf's entrance was indeed quite imposing.
Brother! Ethelwulf! Thank God you are come.
At this time, Ragnar wasn't idle either. He was leading the Vikings in building a fortress on the riverbank. After all, this was a large-scale invasion, and reckless actions were out of the question. Establishing a base to launch surprise attacks was the best strategy. Soon, Ethelwulf arrived at the Vikings' fortress with a large force. Although their numbers were several times that of the Vikings, Ethelwulf hesitated in the face of the ferocious Vikings. He planned to outwit them. Since they're not moving here, we'll set up camp not far away and lay out our defenses and wait for them to attack us. His subordinates were utterly baffled by Ethelwulf's actions.
Lord Athelwulf, forgive us. We only meant...
I know what you meant. You meant that you're already greater warriors than I am. Although only yesterday you were still green, sucking on your mother's breasts. Go do your job. Set up camp.
Little did they know, Ragnar was not as foolish as Ethelwulf. Before Ethelwulf and his men could complete their defenses, Ragnar launched a surprise attack on the enemy camp under the cover of night. They rampaged through the camp, slaughtering unprepared British soldiers. Hearing the clash outside, Ethelwulf was jolted awake from his sleep and quickly grabbed his sword. But astonishingly, the next second, he was kneeling before a crucifix, praying devoutly. With no one to lead them, the disorganized soldiers were quickly slaughtered. Half an hour later, Ethelwulf finished his prayers, but before he could rush out, Floki cut the ropes, trapping him under a tent. Without a doubt, The battle ended in a complete victory for the Vikings, and Ethelwulf became a prisoner. It was only when counting the casualties that Ragnar learned Ethelwulf was King El's brother. He had been worried about how to attack the capital, and now a valuable bargaining chip had literally fallen from the sky. Ragnar was overjoyed. In stark contrast, King El's palace was in an uproar. Given the low productivity of the era, the state couldn't afford a large army. The loss of several hundred soldiers was a significant blow to the king's resources. The ministers suggested that since these barbarians are like demons, coming to plunder, it's better to bribe them with money rather than wasting lives in vain.
Let me think on it just a little while. In the meantime, let it be known, I have sent envoys out to raise more men to arms for our use, if need be.
The next day, Ragnar, with Ethelwulf in tow, arrived at the capital. Seeing his brother alive, El decided to allow Ragnar and his men into the city for negotiations. Ragnar, who was after wealth, immediately agreed to negotiate. Upon their arrival at the palace, the ministers, terrified as if they had seen devils, dared not even breathe heavily. To ease the tense atmosphere, El suggested negotiating over a meal. At the dining table, a stark contrast emerged. The Vikings, like barbarians, grabbed food and stuffed it into their mouths. Meanwhile, the people from the kingdom prayed to Jesus before eating, amusing the Vikings, especially Floki, who seemed particularly fascinated by the ceramic plates.
Shall we talk, King?
The negotiations formally began, and Ragnar, without beating around the bush, directly demanded 2,000 pounds of gold and silver. Many might not grasp the significance of 2,000 pounds. When Bjarni married the Lord's daughter Thyri, it cost only 20 pounds of silver. Ragnar's demand was equivalent to 100 earls' daughters. The ministers were enraged upon hearing this, perceiving it as outright robbery. At a tense moment, King El hesitated but ultimately agreed to Ragnar's demand, with one condition: such a large sum required time to gather. During this time, the Vikings must stay in their camp and not harm his people or their property.
Sire, how can we trust the word of a pagan?
Let me baptize one of them. There is one further condition. I desire that either you or one of your companions agrees to be baptized into our faith. In that way, I can make peace with a friend and fellow Christian, and not an enemy.
You want one of us to become Christian?
Yes.
Hearing this, the Vikings couldn't help but laugh out loud. The Vikings have their own gods, and even when their lives are threatened, they will never abandon their deities. Unexpectedly, Rollo stood up, betraying his faith.
I will be Christian.
The baptism was held by the river, with Floki watching angrily as Rollo completed the ritual. What the Vikings failed to realize was that El's actions were a deliberate delay. The next day, they waited quietly in the camp for the ransom. Floki, hostile towards Rollo for betraying their gods, was about to confront him when King El's men delivered several large chests. Ragnar, excited, sent men to open them, only to find the chests were empty. It was then Ragnar realized this was El's stalling tactic, using the time to gather forces. Soon, a large number of English soldiers charged at them. Unfazed, the Vikings quickly took up shields, ready to make the deceitful English pay in blood. As the English soldiers approached, Ragnar suddenly triggered the trap set earlier. When the enemy was thrown into disarray, the Vikings charged at them like a sharp blade, unleashing a crushing slaughter on this hastily assembled army. Seeing the fierce Vikings, the English dropped their weapons and fled in all directions. The battle was over, but one man was still searching the muddy battlefield for surviving enemies, vowing to exterminate these Christians.
How many Christians did I kill, Floki? How many? You think Odin is still angry with me now?
The Vikings triumphed again, with Rollo and Floki reconciling. Enraged, Ragnar drew a cross in blood on Ethelwulf's head and dragged his corpse back to El's capital with a horse. Such a great humiliation finally made King El recognize the seriousness of offending this group of Vikings. 2 battles had nearly depleted all his forces. Now, El had no choice but to humbly deliver the 2,000 pounds of gold and silver to Ragnar. Ragnar returned home with a full load, leaving behind a furious king gritting his teeth on the shoreline.
I swear before God Almighty, I declare war eternal on the Northman Ragnar Lothbrok. I swear to our Lord Jesus Christ, to the Blessed Virgin, one day I will avenge myself on him, bring him to justice and to death. So help me God.